What I studied particularly was American politics, and then I had a specialty in the presidency, I had a specialty in political communication, and in religion and politics. And where all those things combined were presidential religious rhetoric. So my dissertation studied, and by the way, there's a big difference between, say, someone who would come and say, I have lots of opinions on the current presidential channel, I'm going to share them. Anyone can do that. Social science is much different. For social science, what you want to do is find a question you want to answer, and find a question that can be answered. That's a big trick within this, because lots can't. And something that you can look at systematically. So take everything in a particular category and look at all of it. And so what I did is I looked at presidential religious rhetoric and national public addresses. And you always have to pick an era, so I picked the post-World War II era. And the way I had it end was I had it end with George W. Bush's first term, because I was writing it starting at the near end of George W. Bush's first term, and I definitely wanted to be finished by the end of his second term. And so it's every single televised address, and I started with Harry Truman, and the reason I started with Harry Truman was he was the first person to televise an address. That once he broke that boundary, then they all did it regularly. So it's from the beginning of Harry Truman's term up through everybody after that. So things that I looked at was, first, what religious rhetoric did those presidents, Truman through George W. Bush, use? Second is, how did that help them communicate with the public? And I'll get to a little bit more of that later. Then there's focus groups, because I had a group, sometimes two, from every major religious grouping in the United States, in a town that was a bellwether town. They voted, this town that I went to, they voted 51% for George W. Bush in 2004, and the nation as a whole voted 50.4%. So they're real close. And then second, did the post-World War II American presidents achieve what we call frame resonance by using religious rhetoric? Frame resonance. This is something that stuck with me as a preacher, and it's something that every political speaker wants. Frame resonance is when you say something and everyone out there goes, oh yeah, I know that. They're all searching for that. And there are only so many places that politicians can get. And so religious rhetoric is one of those. So three major theories of religion in American public life. First is an old one from France called secularization. These become more modern. They become more secular. Because religion filled places where science can fill in the gaps and where other things can fill in the gaps. So as we gain more and more knowledge about the world, religion disappears to the background. Second one is civil religion. Civil religion, and by the way, if you want an example of secularization, the theory came from France, and France is a good example of where that happened. Over time, they just became more and more and more secular. Civil religion, that's a very different idea, although related to the person who came up with secularization theory. And civil religion is the idea that there are these overarching values that bind the people in a society. They can be kind of specific, they can be kind of vague, but they're all there, and that's what makes a community of a particular place. A great example of someone who espoused civil religion was Dwight Eisenhower. Because at one point, he was speaking as president, he said, well, I don't care what religion you have, you just need to have one. So, yeah, well, Eisenhower's great. I have lots of stories about him. This was a fun project, and learning more about him was one of the things. Religious pluralism. That is the idea that there is a society, and that there are a whole bunch of different religious groups in that society, including non-believers. So if you remember the quote from Obama's inaugural address, you can see that pluralism is definitely gaining hold in the United States. Is that we're a pluralistic nation, and our national leaders, especially the American president, because that's the one politician who represents the entire electorate in the United States. So, first thing I did was look at, I skipped message formation, because when I speak about presidency, everyone says speechwriters. And speechwriters are important, especially if you're reading every speech that a president wrote, because let me tell you, Jimmy Carter wrote his own speeches, and it was painful. It was really 76 to 80. And Richard Nixon, who did all his things, he had William Safire and Patrick Buchanan as speechwriters. great writers. I love the Nixon years. People that lived through them didn't love them nearly as much as I did. And Nixon would use those different writers for different things. When he wanted to be erudite and learned, he used William Safire. And he wanted to find an opponent and punch that opponent verbally, he used Pat Buchanan. And that's probably the best use I've seen of speechwriters in that era that I studied. So it was 280 speeches, from Truman all the way through George W. Bush's first term. I looked it up, it was 869,000 words. What I found was there was crafted language. I mean, all these speeches are created and reviewed by a whole bunch of people. The main goals of presidential speeches are to gain and maintain public approval. Presidents lead by noting that they have a vision for where the country should go. They give these speeches in order to gain approval for where they want to take the country. That's the main one. Other times there are non-leadership, or there are leadership goals that aren't related to, or directly related to public approval. So say a space shuttle explodes, and the president will go on television. The president doesn't need at that point to gain or maintain public approval. The president's just there to help the nation mourn. Now, why do presidents use religious rhetoric? One, they've done it since George Washington. So if you don't do it, people will notice there's a tradition of doing it. Second is social groups and shared culture. Because sometimes presidents are gearing language to a particular religious group. Sometimes they're gearing it quite broadly to at least about 83% of the American population. And I read this in 2008, so my data is from 2005. 2005, 78% of Americans in a survey claimed to believe in God, and 85.6% believed or claimed a Judeo-Christian affiliation. So if you're good with numbers there, you note that we've got about 8% of the people who are like, I don't really believe in God, but I have this family affiliation. And that's certainly true. Lord knows clergy come across that. So let's see. And last thing I mentioned was frame resonance. Like, presidents are looking for ways to connect to their audience. And there are only so many ways when you're talking about non-policy goals. Because if you say I want to reform Social Security, then you have an immediate group that's interested in Social Security reform. But if you say I just want to speak to you as people, we know of at least two big ones. First one is nationalism. We want to talk about the United States and what our country is like. And that's a huge one, which is beyond what I did. Second, religion comes in next in national addresses. In fact, here's my nice little chart. You can't see, but it turns out that presidents have used a consistent amount of religious rhetoric over time, and then it shot up with Ronald Reagan. And it stayed up until at least the end of George W. Bush's first term. And shot up means that it went from 3%, so the speeches. I read those 280 speeches, 870,000 words. Every single sentence in those speeches I coded as either religious rhetoric or not religious rhetoric. For it to have or be considered religious rhetoric, it needed something specific in it. So a prayer request. I have allusion to Jefferson's theistic words in the Declaration of Independence. So we went from 3% to 7%. Now, why was that? Well, and my data doesn't actually show this, but other people do, is there was more religious rhetoric because there was signaling there, and it was signaling that occurred, or that was strategically happened in the 1970s. Because there was a group of political strategists that recognized that if you were an evangelical, you didn't necessarily have a particular party that you might become affiliated with. And they worked really hard within the Republican Party to try and craft a message that would appeal to evangelicals. And Reagan's the one that finally accomplished that by just signaling an overt religiosity quite more to evangelicals. And it worked quite well for him in the time period. I have a feeling that's ending right about now. But I haven't done systematic research on it. So civil religion. And there are a variety of places. Robert Bellah wrote Habits of the Heart. It was a book that kind of made its round through churches in the 1980s. And his description of civil religion was, what we have then from the earliest years of the Republic is a collection of beliefs, symbols, and rituals with respect to sacred things and institutionalized into a collectivity. But an overarching umbrella over all of society. My definition was a broad thesis communicated by the presidents in a manner that assumes that all listeners share the president's belief. And an example of that comes from Kennedy's inaugural address. So this is January 20, 1961. And Kennedy said, "For I have sworn before you and Almighty God, the same solemn oath our forebears prescribed nearly a century and 3/4 ago." Now, here's my chart. See these little dark lines here? Those are civil religion references. Notice how they disappear with Reagan, who's right here. They disappear with Clinton. We get a little bit more with George W. Bush. And this is post-September 11th that we saw now. By and large, you see the civil religion working its way out of the speeches given by American presidents. You see a lot more of pluralism, or a reference to this religion, this religious group, that religious group. Here's one from George W. Bush in his inaugural address in 2001. "And some needs and hurts are so deep they will only respond to a mentor's touch or a pastor's prayer. Church and charity, synagogue and mosque, lend our communities their humanity, and they will have an honored place in our plans and in our laws." Something to note that's important with George W. Bush's inaugural is it's obviously pre-September 11th. But at this point, Islam's making enough of a presence in the United States that any time a laundry list of religious groups comes into the fray, you always get Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And Barack Obama, and by and large what you get is Christianity, Judaism, Islam, some other group, and secularists, or they'll call non-believers. And secularists are about 17% of the population right now, but the other groups are small enough that they just kind of pick one any given time. So it'll be the Buddhists one day and Hindus the next day. What does this say about the three major theories? Secularization, civil religion, and pluralism. Definitely pluralism is the dominant understanding of the place of religion in public life in the United States. Civil religion is definitely working its way out, and secularization we just don't know. If the secularization theorists were true, the United States should have been a secular place by 1890, and it's not. I should get to focus groups, because we're beyond. Actually, what I'll just tell you is what I did, and then we'll kind of open it up. What I did is I went to this bellwether town that had all those groups that I just mentioned, including black Protestants, voted slightly for the Republicans in 2004, and I showed them clips of speeches. So I showed them the clips, and then I just asked them open-ended questions, nothing more than react to what you just saw. And I'll tell you my findings. One is I found that religious minorities were very tolerant of presidents using religious rhetoric, even New Testament rhetoric. Other finding I had was that religious rhetoric can contribute to political legitimacy for a president in ways that don't register in your standard measures of public opinion. And so this is a statement from a person named Stanley in the Black Protestant church that I went. Can't remember which politician he was talking about at this time. But he said, this person says my religion is part of who I am, and I respect that. I know, he was talking about rape. Next one was that use of religious rhetoric can lead listeners to have very stringent standards for evaluating the actions of a president. So, listeners can be generous or not generous. So what I got from these focus groups is presidents can present shared values with the population through using religious language. They can take, and one thing that all politicians do is they want to stick a picture in your mind. So when George W. Bush said the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, for those that go to Sunday school, that picture can pop right up in your mind, just like it did when you were 7 years old. And the other side of that double-edged sword is that if the population is going to be critical of you, if you use religious language, that gives them a little bit more of a hook in order to say this person says this but does this. So you can get more critiqued because of the religious language that the president would use.